following sermon was delivered at the 10:30 worship service at the United Methodist Church of Kent. Please enjoy.
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. A simple phrase, we learn it early in life, sometimes called the Golden Rule. Some version of it can be found in almost every religion and moral tradition around the world and throughout time. In our Christian tradition, we find Jesus saying this Golden Rule twice in 2 of the 4 Gospels, both in Matthew and in Luke, as part of an extended section of teaching. In Matthew, it's part of the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke, part of the Sermon on the Plain. In Matthew, Jesus says that this rule, this Golden Rule, is the law and the prophets. In other words, it is a summary of the whole tradition. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus emphasizes that doing unto others means all others, not just those whom we like or who like us. If you love those who love you, he says, or do good to those who do good to you, if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, or I'm going to add this morning, if you respect those who vote like you, what good is that, Jesus asks? For that's the way the world already works, and can we really honestly say it's working? Certainly not for everyone. Certainly not as it should, and certainly not as God desires and intends. And so Jesus says we must do unto others as we would have them do unto us, which is to say that we must take the initiative. We must love those who seem unloving. We must do good toward those who do us harm. We must give generously without expectation of anything in return. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Such a simple phrase that still holds the power, still has the power to bring us together and to heal our divided world. And so beginning this morning and continuing for a total of 5 Sundays now, leading up to our next national election on November 5th, in case you haven't heard, in this moment of intense partisan polarization and social fragmentation, together with a number of United Methodist and other congregations all throughout the country, we are going to be exploring and being invited to recommit to this simple yet life-giving rule. This gracious opportunity to build a healthier world, beginning with ourselves. For the first 3 weeks of this series, we'll begin with specific practices highlighted by the prophet Micah, who is writing and speaking and ministering in another time of division and distrust. God has told you, Micah said, what is good, what the Lord requires, to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with God. Justice, kindness, and humility, then, are the first 3 practices that we will consider through the lens of this Golden Rule. And then, during the final 2 weeks of this series, we'll explore 2 more practices of compassion and advocacy. Together, these 5 practices form the foundation of what we're going to be calling our campaign for compassion. During this election season, amid so much noise, more broadly than any particular candidate or party or issue, we are campaigning for compassion, refocusing on our core values at the very core of our voting and our living, doing unto others as we would have them do unto us, broadening our care beyond ourselves to God's beloved community. And so today we begin with justice. Being just, voting, acting justly. There is, of course, no shortage of scriptures that call us to practice justice, for justice is fundamental to our faith. From the prophets to the Psalms, to the Gospels, to the letters of the early church, certainly to the beginnings of our Methodist movement, a movement which always has insisted that our piety, that our personal holiness, our personal relationship with God always must be expressed in the world through social justice. Our love of God must be lived through the pursuit of justice for all of creation. And our scriptures are filled then with lessons and examples for how we do this. Today's reading from Luke, for example, sometimes referred to as Jesus' first sermon. If it is a sermon, it's a short one, but it causes quite a stir. And that is precisely because it's a sermon all about justice. Specifically, it's a sermon all about economic justice, which is never easy for us to hear or to do. And yet, economic justice is front and center for God throughout our scriptures, throughout the history of the church. Because justice for God is not about getting back at folks who have harmed us or making them pay some price or some debt to society. Justice for God is restorative. Justice is about bringing folks together. Justice is about healing and closing the gaps that exist between us, ensuring equal access and opportunity for everyone. And from housing to health care to education to food, there is nothing that separates us. There is nothing that divides us and keeps us apart from our neighbors quite like money and what we do with it. And so that's what Jesus addresses in his first so-called sermon. He reads from Isaiah chapter 61, "And everyone who hears him that day knows exactly what that means," especially that last bit, that last phrase about the year of the Lord's favor. Now that is a very specific phrase. It has a very particular meaning and direction, and although we have mostly forgotten it over the years, those who heard Jesus that day certainly knew it. They knew that this, the year of the Lord's favor, was the practice of Jubilee. Jubilee is the year of the Lord's favor. Jubilee is this biblical practice of justice that reaches all the way back to Moses. It was understood as God's desire for us that every 50 years, everyone must give back any property and any wealth that they had gained in the competitive sport we call the economy. And so, for example, if my family had obtained from your family any property, any wealth, at any point during the past half century, no matter how we did so, whether ethically, legally, or not, after 50 years, whatever my family had gained from yours had to be given back to you. In this way, through this very deliberate, community-focused practice, every 50 years, the playing field was leveled. Everyone started back at square one, so that no one could accumulate too much and no one could fall too far behind. Property is returned, debts canceled. Everyone takes a break for at least a year from the mad scramble to accumulate and hoard and consume. Everyone goes back to the same starting line, because otherwise, if we just keep on endlessly accumulating, we'll end up where we're living, frankly, now, with lots of folks back at the starting line, while others of us, like myself, simply by chance of where and when we have been born, start miles and miles out ahead. This is the core of our Scripture's vision and practice of justice. This requirement from God, this year of the Lord's favor that curbs economic transactions, that ends our vast inequities by restoring everyone to their place at the table. Because life in beloved community is not about getting ahead. Life in beloved community is about sharing well. That's economic justice. That's the biblical practice of Jubilee. And whether or not we're willing to practice it fully, to get on board with God's notion of economic justice, there are certainly aspects of Jubilee well worth considering as we do justice unto others, both through our voting and through our living. The first, perhaps, is that Jubilee is a material action taken with intentionality. Jubilee confronts head-on the very real disparities in access and opportunity that expand and build among us over time. So justice is not just thinking nice thoughts. Justice is real change, addressing root causes, reinvesting actual money, actual property into communities and neighbors who have been historically and currently under-resourced. Justice is love being practiced. When we notice the vast inequities that exist among us, when we become aware, for example, of the persisting pay gap between genders, or the wealth gap perpetuated still between black and white Americans, when we learn that a person's zip code is a better predictor of that person's health and life expectancy than their genetic code, when we notice neighbors not just being left behind passively, but actively and structurally being pushed back and held down, We cannot just say nice things about them or wish that the world would become better. Doing unto others means doing something to make that better world a reality, pursuing justice through loving activity. Second, if you haven't noticed it already, Jubilee, economic justice, is really, really hard. In the world as we have constructed it, a world obsessed with accumulating and competing, economic justice just might be the most outrageous call of our Christian faith. For the fact is, we don't want to divest from ourselves in order to reinvest in our neighbors. The fact is, we don't want to close the gap between ourselves and those around us. For after all, we have been taught our whole lives through that we should get ahead of our neighbors, that we should win. That's what matters, that we should be the best, the top of the heap. We don't want to return to our neighbors what we, or certainly our ancestors before us, have acquired. What's mine is mine, not theirs. Just so, those who heard Jesus that day resisted his call to economic justice. They knew that releasing prisoners and liberating the oppressed meant canceling debts and welcoming impoverished and imprisoned folks back into the community and prioritizing the common good above personal benefit. And Luke tells us just after the part of the story that we read today that those who heard Jesus were filled with rage. So much rage, in fact, that they try to kill him that day by throwing him off a cliff. And while we know he escaped that day, we know also that eventually they caught up to him and they put him on a cross because they didn't want the year of the Lord's favor. They didn't want economic justice because justice requires more than just tinkering around the edges of the system we already have. Justice requires a whole new way of thinking and living, and that's really hard. But third, the reason we do pursue it, the reason we do materially divest from ourselves and reinvest in others to close the gap between us, is that we have been caught up in God's dream for this world, God's larger, more life-giving vision of the world as it can be and should be and shall be, and we want to be a part of it. God's dream for this world, God's dream for this world, our now divided and distrustful world, is not about clinging to access or prioritizing ourselves. God's dream is beloved community on earth as it is in heaven, as we will pray together soon. A world where none are under threat, a world where none are at risk, a world where none are in danger because all are valued, all are cherished, all are cared for, and not just in theory, but really and materially. And that dream, that beloved community, it can only come about when our present cycles are broken open and when we choose to invest ourselves differently, when we choose to do unto others instead of waiting for someone else to do it for us. When obscene wealth and privileges persist alongside generational vulnerabilities and basic human needs, healthcare, housing, food, education, that gap must be healed. Those inequities must be leveled out so that everyone knows truly we are in this together and we can discover better ways to live as neighbors. We each, by God's grace, have a role in that. Whatever our age, whatever our station, whatever our partisan persuasion, we each have a role as midwives of God's dream. Now, maybe you already know what your role is. If so, by God's grace, then I pray that you will have the courage and you will have the conviction to keep on keeping on, because this work, friends, is really hard. But if you don't, if you're not yet sure how God is calling you, then I would encourage you to visit the website of our United Methodist Church's General Board of Church and Society. There at umcjustice.org, you will find more than 30 different social justice issues about which our United Methodist Church already is actively working to make a real, loving difference in our world. We just talked about economic justice this morning, but of course there are so many other ways to pursue justice too. Criminal justice reform, eliminating the death penalty, supporting workers' rights, immigrants' rights, voting rights, LGBTQ+ rights, global disarmament, gun violence prevention, resisting the rising influence of Christian nationalism here in the United States, ensuring equal access to health care, including reproductive health care for all, and to quality education. Those are just a few of the ways that our denomination already is pursuing justice. There's so many more opportunities, too, to learn, to get involved, to partner with other United Methodists toward a more just world. If you need help finding more information or getting plugged in, please let me know. And begin, of course, in prayer, in prayerful reflection. Prayerfully reflect in the coming days and weeks. What are the injustices in our world that break your heart? What are the injustices that keep you up at night? Not just worries for yourself or for your own family, but who are the neighbors that you sense God leading you to reach out to and to learn from and to encourage and support? Where are the gaps? Right here in our own community. And how can you invest your resources to help heal them? And now, as we prepare to vote, what are the policies and who are the policy makers that will serve not our own personal interests, but the interests of our broader community, beginning with the most vulnerable of our neighbors? How can we vote to close the gaps between us? How can we vote to build up the common good? By grace, may we pray and may we work. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the United Methodist Church of Kent Sermon Podcast. For more information about the church, visit www.kentmethodist.org.